My name is Alon Justice Pavlinich. My pronouns are he, him, his. This video is being recorded on the traditional territory of the Miamis, the Piankeshaws, the Potawatomis, and the Shawnees. I acknowledge the enduring legacies and relationships between Indigenous peoples and their sacred territories, lands and waters from which I am benefiting. I honor the people, their histories, and the relationships we build together. Welcome to Module 2, which focuses on anti-racist and multicultural communications. As we learned in our class discussion following Peggy McIntosh's Unpacking the Privileged Knapsack, a critical approach to our lived experiences reveals that our culture predominantly privileges white people, and mostly assumes that white is the default subject position. Because of this, many white people are blind to systemic racism, simply because it doesn't affect them. One common argument is that white people can't be racist, or shouldn't have to think responsibly about the effects of racism simply because they have encountered hardships in their own lives. The difference, however, is that skin color was not one of the things making their lives difficult. Statistically, white people have more access to opportunities and resources in America. So let's look at how systemic racism influences our language and communications. I sometimes catch myself using binary categories of white and black or light and dark as metaphors that correspond to good and bad. Similarly, Karen Catlin calls out tech industry jargon for continuing to employ phrases such as master and slave for backup systems and whitelist, blacklist for algorithm filters. Think critically about this for a moment. If we continuously associate good with white and bad with black, aren't we subconsciously convincing ourselves to be racists? Kenneth and Mamie Clark conducted a series of experiments to test the effects of segregation on African American children in the 1940s. When presented with white and black dolls, most black children expressed preference for the white doll, and when they explained why, it was because they associated whiteness with goodness, and they identified the black doll as bad. Well, this test was recreated in 2010. That's 60 years after desegregation, and about a year after the first black president of the United States. And the results still reveal a bias towards lighter skin. The ways that we use language have real consequences. Claiming that you aren't a racist isn't sufficient. We have to actually acknowledge the problems in the world, our complicity in them, and then change our behaviors in response. That's anti-racism. When referring to good and bad, find a better metaphor than light and dark. Or, better yet, just say what you mean. Practice using plain language, which we covered earlier in this semester, to communicate clearly and concisely. In some instances, we need to discuss race and cultural differences explicitly. So, here's a few tips. Use Hispanic when referring to people from Spanish-speaking cultures, including Spain, Mexico, the Caribbean, Central and South America. Latino is for men, Latina is for women, and Latinx is more inclusive. Each of these specifies people from Latin America. People of color is a broad term that refers to non-white people. Don't use such a generalization when you mean black people specifically. African American is okay, but it only refers to Americans. Black is preferable, but this may change on a case-by-case basis. White people seem to be uncomfortable using the word black because many of them are deeply uncomfortable with issues of race. That's cowardice. White people aren't the ones suffering from systemic racism. Using the word black with respect for the people it represents is one way to acknowledge racial differences respectfully. White people do not get to use the N-word without reproach. Here's why. The N-word was used to oppress black people. oppressed people can reclaim words and thus rob them of their power to oppress. So when a black person uses the N-word, they are taking it from their oppressor. But when someone who isn't black uses that word, they are participating in a long history of oppression. That word is off limits, even when white people are singing along with a black artist. I recommend censoring yourself if that word is dropped in the lyrics. And if you think it's too much effort to censor yourself, then imagine what it would have been like to have been enslaved. Imagine the difficulties experienced by black people even today in a deeply racist country. You're asked to give up one word out of respect. It's not that hard. Black and white may be used as simple adjectives when referring to skin color. However, you will notice that I capitalize black because it refers to a specific culture. Kimberly Crenshaw, who you may recall from our discussion about intersectionality, observes that black refers to a specific cultural group and should be signified as a proper noun. Similarly, Temple University professor Lori L. Tharps explains that when speaking of a culture, ethnicity, or group of people, the name should be capitalized. Black with a capital B refers to people of the African diaspora. Lowercase black is simply a color. Ever since African people arrived in this country, we have had to fight for the right to a proper name. Upon arrival in the New World, we were all collectively deemed Africans, even though we came from different countries, cultures, and tribes. By the same token, I do not capitalize white. Capitalizing black is a way of respecting a cultural identity, and this practice implicitly recognizes the erasure of black people's origins due to slavery, histories and ancestries that many white Americans get to enjoy. Another rhetorical strategy worth noting here is that I am citing black women. Do not speak for groups of people to which you do not belong. Moreover, when people, particularly marginalized people, share their experiences and make recommendations for best practices, believe them. Experience is authority. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement has exposed injustice and a long history of police brutality. But when some people said Black Lives Matter, others responded with All Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter in an attempt to whitewash calls for social justice. These phrases attempt to undermine the valid experiences of people of color. These responses are examples of systemic racism at work. People use rhetoric to pave over their own racism and to avoid accountability. No one said only Black Lives Matter. The point is, in this country, black lives have not been treated with the same honor. All lives cannot matter until everyone acknowledges, with conviction, that black lives matter. In the case of Indigenous and First Peoples, specificity is always better. Be specific whenever possible. If you're talking about a specific tribe of Indigenous people, then say Inuit. But when you cannot identify a specific tribe, Indigenous and First Peoples is preferable. Never Indian. That offensive word derives from Christopher Columbus, who wrongly thought he had reached East Asia. Also, Christopher Columbus was a genocidal tyrant, as explained concisely in this infographic from The Oatmeal, also linked in the description below. So it's wrong to brand diverse people with a single name that was enforced by a mistake made by their oppressor. Hence why more and more communities are moving towards replacing Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. Since we're on the subject, you've probably heard me refer to the November break and the December break, rather than specific holidays. Our institutions, school, work, government, even families, are multicultural. Not everyone recognizes the same holidays. Think about how you can use more inclusive language. November break and happy holidays are phrases that invite more people into the conversation. Ask yourself, if you're using certain terms, are you respecting or appropriating someone else's culture? In the workplace, don't refer to a powwow when you're calling a meeting. Don't describe power dynamics in terms of chiefs and Indians, and don't use a totem pole as a metaphor for corporate hierarchies. Otherwise, you've just used someone else's culture out of context for your own purposes without acknowledging Indigenous peoples. That's appropriation. Cultural appropriation is all around us, as we're seeing with the recent reckoning of popular sports teams such as the Cleveland Indians and Kansas City Chiefs. These names, representations, and merchandise are markers of racism. Sports franchises such as these are raking millions of dollars into the pockets of oppressors with no regard or compensation for the people from whom they are stealing. And since we're on the subject of signs and images, the Confederate flag is a symbol of white supremacy. There's no creative spin or context-specific representation that will erase that. The Confederate flag tells the rest of the world that the person displaying it is a racist. Learn from the mistakes of others. How do you think your Indigenous colleagues are going to feel about the person at work who is wearing a jersey with a caricature of their people on it? How will your Black colleagues feel about a Confederate flag bumper sticker in the parking lot? Once again, these are skills that begin with the ways in which we use language. It's not sufficient to just claim that you're not a racist. Anyone can say that. You are being called upon as responsible, ethical professionals and citizens to practice anti-racism. Being mindful of your language and the experiences of other people is a good place to start. Finally, you will recall at the beginning of this video, I introduced myself and I acknowledged the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples on whose land I am currently living. The Miamis, the Piankashaws, the Potawatomis, and the Shawnees. I encourage you to consult nativegov.org about why land acknowledgments are an important step in recognizing complicity in the ongoing effects of colonialism. Then do some research and learn about the Indigenous people who continue to inhabit the lands on which you live. At some point in your academic and professional careers, you will be called upon to perform a live presentation. An introduction, such as the one I model for you at the beginning of this video, is one way to connect with diverse audiences. Here are a few additional pitfalls to avoid. First of all, avoid colloquialisms. Colloquialisms are informal phrases that are only meaningful to native speakers. A sort of conversational turn of phrase, such as ballpark, used to describe a generalization. Rain check, meaning to reschedule something, spill the beans, urging someone to reveal some information, or piece of cake, suggesting that something was easy. The problem is that these terms are really difficult for audiences for whom English is not their first language. Imagine translating these literally. Each of those phrases would be so confusing out of context. So in professional circumstances, it's best to avoid colloquialisms such as these. Just make it a little easier on your audiences who are working really hard to translate your message. Think back to our lessons on plain language. Just say what you mean. Be concise and precise. Let's move on to class issues. Avoid using the term lower class. This imposes a judgment on the individual's character rather than emphasizing income. Good people can live among humble circumstances. Read any Charles Dickens book ever. Wealthy people can be morally and ethically reprehensible. Again, Charles Dickens, A Christmas Story, or any of the Housewives episodes. Think about the implications of your words here. Instead of referring to an individual or group of people as lower class, try working class or lower income. This shows up in other terms as well. For example, I would urge you to avoid describing something as ghetto when you mean that it is of poor quality, because you're suggesting that people who aren't being paid a living wage are used to such conditions. And yes, there is a racist connotation here as well. So a better synonym would be something like shoddy, cheap, or junky. Here are some final handy tips. Do not use your own group as a reference point that implies normality or superiority. When discussing racial and ethnic differences, do not imply any sort of deficits. Turn that critical lens inward and try to be mindful of any sort of assumptions you may be making regarding gender, race, disability, sexual orientation, or any other sort of group. We all have implicit biases to wrestle with, so I'm doing this work right alongside you. Be a good scholar and professional. Do your research. Use credible sources. Don't speak for other people. And cite or signal boost the experiences of marginalized people who are consistently silenced or ignored. Remember to handle missteps with grace. If someone corrects you, that is an opportunity to learn, to grow, to be a better colleague and ally. Accept the criticism. Reflect on it. Apply it as necessary. And remember that you are participating in a process. It's ongoing. These are some best practices. For now, things change. Language evolves, and terms can fall out of favor. So be open to change and corrections. We are all works in progress. The point is to apply ourselves to continue to be conscientious colleagues and citizens. Now, you're in charge of writing the diversity and inclusion statement for your company. Scroll down to the video description below for an assignment overview, including links for some important documents you'll want to refer to. First, take a look at some of the examples provided below. What do they do effectively? What can you refine? Among those examples linked, you'll find Apple, Disney, Netflix, Target, and since I don't ask you to write anything I wouldn't do myself, you'll also find a link to my personal commitment to diversity and inclusion. Are these statements sensitive to issues regarding cultures, race, country of birth, age, disability, sexuality, and gender expression? Your statement ought to include a well-crafted mission statement that clearly identifies the values of your company and the ways in which those values intersect with diverse audiences. Don't just make some vague umbrella statement. Over the course of this semester, I've asked you to think about what makes you, specifically, an asset to any working environment and the broader community in which your business is situated. Use that. Identify a specific field in which you intend to work, even if it's your own startup company. Consider your company's goals and your location. What opportunities or challenges are present in that context? Don't just repeat a bunch of buzzwords and stock phrases. Define diversity, equity, and inclusion in your own words. Explain why these are important. Take a moment to reflect. Be genuine. Develop empathy by observing the lived experiences of marginalized people in their own words. If you aren't familiar, now's the time to start doing some reading or just click around YouTube to learn about other worldviews. Then, include an action plan. Remember, business and technical writing get work done. Words on a page mean very little if there's no follow-through. Explain your goals and how exactly you plan to achieve them. Which specific underrepresented groups are you conscious of? What efforts are you making to be more inclusive regarding employees and customer service? Is this a year-long action plan, ongoing efforts? How will you monitor your progress? I encourage you to use positive, productive terms, such as celebrate, empower, improve, innovate, promote, and welcome. Your statement should be around 100 words. When you've completed this statement, format your document according to professional standards. You can find a written explanation of this assignment in the expanded video description below. But wait, this is only the first step. See the next video segment to learn how to complete this assignment. Thanks for watching. Now, let's make the effort to be more inclusive in our practices and mindful of other people in our daily lives.